Have you ever heard about the man who rose from a cramped Scottish cottage to surpass even the Rockefellers in wealth? Welcome to the secret world of the Carnegie family, where steel fortunes and high society elegance collide with hidden tragedies and controversial labor strikes. It all started with Andrew Carnegie, an immigrant telegraph boy in Pittsburgh who built a steel empire, famously selling it for what would be a jaw-dropping $310 billion in today's money. Yet behind the dignified philanthropy of funding 2,500 libraries, Carnegie Hall, and Carnegie Mellon University lurks the lingering stain of ruthless cost-cutting and brutal labor disputes. Join us as we peel back the layers of this remarkable dynasty to uncover how Andrew Carnegie evolved from new money, steel baron, to an old money icon of American nobility, yet never escaped the whispers of scandal. From the Homestead strike that stained his legacy to the close-guarded stories of his only child, Margaret, and the family's carefully managed fortune, the Carnegie's tale is a mosaic of ambition, power, tragedy, and triumph. Stick around to discover how one family rewrote the rules on wealth, shaped global philanthropy, and still kept so many secrets under lock and key. Ready to dive in? Let's explore the hidden life of the Carnegies. Let's step back in time to the summer of 1892, when a small steel town outside Pittsburgh became the center of one of the bloodiest labor conflicts in U.S. history, the Homestead Strike. At the heart of this drama were two men: Andrew Carnegie, already famous for his meteoric rise from Scottish immigrant to steel baron, and his right-hand manager, Henry Clay Frick. While Carnegie's public persona was that of a benevolent benefactor advocating for peace and harmony in the workplace, secret internal memos and eyewitness accounts paint a more disturbing picture. Behind the scenes, he had signed off on cost-cutting measures that would lead to confrontation, and he later tried to distance himself from the resulting violence. In a stark reminder that philanthropic gestures can exist side by side with ruthless business decisions, the strike turned deadly when Pinkerton agents clashed with workers, leaving at least 10 dead. Many sources, including various historical newspapers, put the number at 10. Others suggest it might have been 9 workers and a Pinkerton, but the consensus is that multiple lives were lost. Carnegie was in Scotland at the time, enjoying a well-deserved rest at his estate in the Highlands. Yet records, including those referenced by Smithsonian Magazine, reveal that he was hardly oblivious. In fact, he was sending letters to Frick that arguably encouraged a hardline approach toward union demands. Today, various archives, memoirs, letters, and even recently digitized materials from universities such as Carnegie Mellon have cast new light on what some label as a cover-up orchestrated to shield Carnegie's reputation as a man of the people. By 1892, Andrew Carnegie was already hailed as one of the great American success stories. He had risen from near poverty after immigrating to the United States in 1848, taken advantage of the booming railroad industry, and eventually built a steel empire that fed America's insatiable appetite for expansion. A cursory glance at any U.S. history textbook will tell you that Carnegie's steel provided the backbone for railroads, skyscrapers, and bridges. He wrote Triumphant Democracy, an optimistic treatise praising the possibilities of the United States, and spoke publicly about elevating the common worker. Yet behind this carefully crafted image stood an equally driven and, at times, merciless businessman who believed that cost-cutting and efficiency were paramount. According to numerous sources, including David Nassau's authoritative biography, Andrew Carnegie, and various articles from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette analyzing primary documents, Carnegie was more than just vaguely supportive of Henry Clay Frick's handling of labor disputes. He had explicitly given Frick a mandate to reduce costs. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, AAISW, was one of the strongest unions in the nation at that time, and its leadership stood firmly against wage cuts and the erosion of their rights. Carnegie knew these men were no pushovers. They had negotiated contracts before that forced employers to take the union's power seriously. But the Homestead Works, one of Carnegie's flagship steel mills, was up for contract renewal that year. Carnegie and Frick were determined to break the union's stronghold and implemented wage reductions that spurred the union to call a strike. Let's talk about Henry Clay Frick for a moment. He was the industrialist behind the rise of the Carnegie Steel Empire's coke, a vital fuel in steelmaking. Frick's personal philosophies on labor relations were blunt, to say the least. He disliked unions, saw them as an infringement on the efficiency of business, and was determined to root them out. There's a famous exchange recounted in various books, including Paul Krause's The Battle for Homestead, where Frick, when asked if he feared the consequences of antagonizing workers, allegedly replied that he didn't care what it took as long as production continued on his terms. While it's important to note that some of these anecdotes are secondhand and subject to the biases of those who recorded them, they remain consistent with the official record of Frick's actions. By June of 1892, tensions were escalating at Homestead. The union discovered that Frick intended to lock them out if they wouldn't accept lower wages. Workers responded by vowing not to budge. What followed, famously known as the Homestead Strike, was an all-out test of wills, culminating in Frick hiring Pinkerton agents to secure the plant and help bring in strikebreakers. It's worth remembering that in the late 19th century, the Pinkerton Detective Agency wasn't just doing the kind of private investigative work we might think of today. They were a quasi-militarized force often used to subdue labor disputes. The Homestead confrontation in early July 1892 was brutal. As recounted by eyewitnesses and reported by newspapers like the Pittsburgh Dispatch and the New York Times of the period, barges carrying hundreds of Pinkertons floated down the Monongahela River under cover of night. Strikers had fortified the plant and set up lookouts and barricades. When the Pinkertons tried to land, a gunfight erupted, lasting many hours. The exact sequence of who shot first is still debated, but the violence left at least 10 individuals dead, most of them workers, with others injured. Carnegie's role in this tragedy has been scrutinized from every angle. In official statements made after the bloodshed, he claimed ignorance, stating that Frick had acted independently and that he, Carnegie, was too far away, in scenic Scotland, to fully grasp the severity of the situation in real time. However, letters from Carnegie to Frick, discussed in detail in scholarly works, and even the Smithsonian Magazine, show that he had urged a tough stance against the Union, telling Frick to do the dirty work while he, Carnegie, remained out of the country. The language in these letters may not have explicitly called for violence, but it's clear that Carnegie was aware of the potential for confrontation. One letter that's often cited by historians includes a line where Carnegie seemed to encourage Frick to fix the Union problem once and for all, leaving Frick an alarming amount of discretion. The notion that Carnegie's manager decided to escalate the conflict on his own is, therefore, dubious at best. While there is no definitive smoking gun letter from Carnegie instructing Frick to kill strikers, memos discovered in the Henry Clay Frick papers at the Frick Collection in New York highlight how necessary measures could be taken to secure the mill. Many of these memos were quietly filed away or heavily redacted in earlier decades, fueling rumors of a cover-up. As late as the mid-20th century, certain documents were withheld from public view. Some reemerged only when historians convinced the Frick collection to open its archival records. Piecing them together with Union records and diaries from the workers' side forms a mosaic that strongly implicates Carnegie in, at minimum, a tacit acceptance of the violent approach. A critical note that often emerges in blog posts and articles about Homestead, including those referencing discussions from labor historians online, is that some individuals claim a direct murder plot initiated by Carnegie, an alleged plan to exterminate Union leaders. While such claims might appear in sensational or conspiratorial corners of the internet, there is no reliable evidence that Carnegie or Frick drew up a plan to kill Union members deliberately as a strategy. The violence, though lethal and horrifying, is generally understood by mainstream historians to have been the result of a botched attempt to retake the mill with heavily armed Pinkertons, not a literal plan to massacre workers. That said, the readiness with which the Pinkertons came equipped for lethal force speaks volumes about the leadership's willingness to risk bloodshed for control of the mill. The question arises, why did Andrew Carnegie choose to be in Scotland at such a pivotal moment? Many historians argue that he intentionally left Frick to handle the dirty work. He understood that if the public saw him personally authorizing force, it would clash mightily with his cultivated image as the friend of labor. Carnegie famously built public libraries, funded philanthropic causes, and wrote passionately about what he called the gospel of wealth, a philosophy urging the wealthy to use their fortunes to benefit society. But any illusions that he was simply a benevolent entrepreneur vanish when confronted with the letters and memos that show. At best, he turned a blind eye to the brutality, and at worst, he actively endorsed it. A widely cited example is a letter in which Carnegie encouraged Frick to ensure that there would be no backward step, implying an unwavering approach to negotiations, even if it escalated hostilities. The Homestead strike quickly became a national flashpoint, with labor advocates denouncing Carnegie as a traitor to the working class. The union's fight was ultimately crushed. Frick brought in scab labor. The Pinkertons secured the mill, though not without an intense confrontation that ended with the Pinkertons surrendering to the enraged crowd initially, which ironically required local authorities to protect the Pinkertons from harm. The state militia soon arrived, taking control of the area and ensuring that Frick's hired workers could operate the plant. Over time, the union was left in disarray, and the company slashed wages further, effectively curtailing the power of organized labor at Homestead for decades. Carnegie, meanwhile, returned to the United States, attempted to patch up his image, and continued to position himself as a champion of the laborer. But in many eyes, the damage was done. If you're intrigued by how magnates of the Gilded Age balanced a polished public persona with the gritty realities of their power plays, then Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth is a perfect example of that duality. Imagine a man who, on one hand, funds libraries, endows universities, and speaks eloquently about the moral obligations of the rich, yet on the other hand quietly endorses, or at least doesn't impede, violent cost-cutting measures like the Homestead strike. Within this paradox lies a big question. Did Carnegie truly write every word of the famous 1889 essay that enshrined him as a benevolent champion of philanthropy? Or was it significantly reshaped by anonymous collaborators who aimed to smooth over his reputation? Several well-known publications, including Smithsonian Magazine, have suggested that ghostwriters, or heavy-handed editors, might have softened the edges of his ideas. While not every historian agrees on how much was ghostwritten, Some say that even if outside writers were involved, Carnegie remained central to the ideas. Scraps of editorial notes and correspondence hint that the essay may not have been as purely Carnegie's voice as we've all been led to believe. This mystery gains extra depth when you recall that Carnegie was simultaneously entangled in events like the Homestead strike, which we've previously explored in detail. Homestead left a dark stain on his public image because it resulted in Pinkerton agents firing on striking workers, leaving multiple people dead and countless injured. While Carnegie tried to distance himself physically, he was in Scotland at the time. Letters and cables have come to light suggesting that he'd approved a tough stance on the Union. Many critics at the time found it ironic that, just a few years earlier, this same man had penned, or at least endorsed, the so-called Gospel of Wealth, which urged wealthy individuals to distribute their riches for the public good rather than hoard them or pass them all down through inheritance. It's little wonder, then, that rumors of ghostwriting spread. How could someone preach philanthropic ideals so passionately and yet tolerate or quietly encourage a manager like Henry Clay Frick to take extreme and sometimes deadly measures against labor? Perhaps the conflict between his public persona and his actual business practices was so glaring that he needed professional help to massage his text into a persuasive moral blueprint. Let's talk about how the Gospel of Wealth first reached the public. Andrew Carnegie's essay was published in June 1889 in the North American Review, a respected periodical that frequently featured essays from prominent intellectuals, politicians, and business leaders of the era. In it, Carnegie famously argued that the rich have a sacred responsibility to administer their excess wealth in a way that benefits society, a notion that was both innovative and controversial at the time. He claimed that leaving large sums to one's children was wasteful. They might never learn to work, and that simply bestowing fortunes upon charities at death was less praiseworthy than taking action during one's lifetime. The essay set off considerable debate. Many applauded Carnegie for articulating a moral framework in an age of rapacious capitalism, while others found him patronizing or even hypocritical. Historians who defend Carnegie's original authorship note that his personal letters, some of which are archived at the Library of Congress and Carnegie Mellon University, reflect a voice strikingly consistent with the tone of Gospel of Wealth. Indeed, Carnegie himself had long nurtured an interest in philosophy, reading widely, corresponding with intellectuals, and championing the power of education. But skeptics point to scattered references in editorial correspondences, some kept in the records of the North American Review, and others in the possession of private collectors, that show more than a few back-and-forth discussions with unnamed assistants or editors Carnegie had hired. One editor wrote in a letter, quoted in a blog post by an independent researcher who later cited university archives, that his team had been asked to refine Carnegie's text to ensure it conveyed the right tone and to remove passages that might sound too self-congratulatory or contradictory to his business practices. While we don't have the entire set of early drafts, some believe that certain documents were lost, destroyed, or locked away in family archives. There is enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that this piece was massaged more than the typical essay. The comparison to William Randolph Hearst's sensationalistic journalism is a telling parallel. Hearst famously recognized the power of shaping public opinion, cranking out yellow journalism that attracted readers with exaggerated or scandalous headlines. Though Hearst and Carnegie operated in somewhat different spheres, Hearst in publishing and media, Carnegie in steel, they shared a keen awareness of how strategic messaging could burnish a person's image. Hearst's tabloids often twisted narratives to serve his political or personal aims. In a comparable vein, the final version of the Gospel of Wealth may have been intended, at least in part, to mitigate the harsh reality of Carnegie's labor policies by emphasizing the moral dimension of wealth distribution. If the essay hammered home the point that the wealthy are trustees for the poorer classes, it could overshadow criticisms that Carnegie's fortune stemmed from draconian cost-cutting and strike-breaking. That's where the link to Homestead becomes especially potent. The Homestead Strike of 1892, just 3 years after the publication of Gospel of Wealth, revealed how willing Carnegie was to back management tactics that included lethal force against workers defending their wages and union rights. Smithson Magazine, referencing the contents of certain letters, shows that Carnegie was not as distant from those decisions as he claimed to be, even if Henry Clay Frick was the one physically on site. For many observers, the discrepancy between Carnegie's philanthropic manifesto and the brutality of Homestead was jarring. The notion that he paid professional writers or heavily relied on editorial staff to tweak his philanthropic message becomes all the more plausible. A steel magnate who both fosters violence at the mill and in writing champions social benevolence might need a public relations buffer. Now the question of actual ghostwriters arises. Some modern scholars see ghostwriting as a staple of high-profile individuals with busy schedules, especially for those who might not be professional writers, but want to produce a philosophical or policy-oriented essay. Even presidents, celebrities, and well-known business magnates have used ghostwriters. So why should Andrew Carnegie be exempt from speculation? We have partial glimpses, notes from an editor or collaborator who might have said something like, "We've adjusted the language in this section to make it gentler," or "We removed a paragraph that seemed too braggy," or "We reworked the entire conclusion to align with a tone of moral duty." However, the identities of these supposed ghostwriters remain murky. Some suspect they might have been professional journalists or academics Carnegie was acquainted with. Others guess they were simply editorial staff working for the North American Review. So far, no one has definitively pinned down a single name with verifiable evidence. The speculation is rampant, and the internet abounds with theories, some plausible, some outlandish. An excellent example of the ephemeral trail left by potential ghostwriters is a mention in the private correspondence of a certain Horace Greene, who was known to do editorial work for top-tier businessmen. A blog post analyzing letters attributed to Greene, though not conclusively proven to be genuine, suggested that he was hired on more than one occasion to smooth over the Steel Baron's image. Another rumored figure is a journalist from the Pittsburgh area who wrote for local newspapers, but again, documents remain elusive. The final text of the Gospel of Wealth, as published, is typically attributed to Andrew Carnegie alone, and so far, no major library or archive has turned up a manuscript covered in someone else's editorial handwriting. Nonetheless, the search for these documents is very much alive among historians and enthusiasts. Some have combed through the Andrew Carnegie Birthplace Museum in Dunfermline, Scotland, and the archives of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, hoping to find letters or draft manuscripts, while they've unearthed fascinating materials about his philanthropic ventures, including documentation on his library building programs, scholarships, and the funding of Carnegie Hall. Hard evidence of ghostwriters or large-scale editorial manipulation remains elusive. That secrecy might be due to the era's more informal approach to authorship. Maybe it was customary for powerful figures to rely on assistants whose role was never officially acknowledged. One must consider that ghostwriting, while not uncommon, was less openly discussed in late 19th century America. There wasn't the same cultural acceptance of the practice as there might be today, nor was there a uniform code requiring explicit credit. Even well-known authors sometimes used literary assistants who might rewrite large sections of text. Carnegie's philanthropic message, if significantly ghost-written, would have been a carefully orchestrated form of public relations, an effort to distance himself from the savage realities of steel mill management. If so, it worked remarkably well. To this day, many people think of Andrew Carnegie primarily as the philanthropic patron saint of libraries, rather than the millionaire behind one of the bloodiest labor disputes in American industrial history. Have you ever heard the story of two men who joined forces to build one of the greatest steel empires in American history, only to turn against each other so intensely that their feud became a legend of corporate sabotage and lawsuits? That's exactly what happened with Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick, two titans of the Gilded Age who first climbed to the peak of industrial success together, then watched their alliance collapse in a blaze of resentment, rumors, and legal battles. The New York Times has noted that, after the infamous Homestead Strike of 1892, their relationship deteriorated to the point where Carnegie allegedly spread rumors intended to tarnish Frick's reputation and disrupt his business ventures. Though the Homestead fiasco often draws the most attention for its bloodshed and union busting, the breakup between Carnegie and Frick is equally riveting, full of backroom dealings, cutting remarks in court, and whispers of behind-the-scenes intrigue that rival the high-profile quarrels of the Astor family or the inheritance disputes of the Vanderbilts. We already know from the Homestead Strike how Andrew Carnegie, a steel magnate who publicly championed the philanthropic ideals spelled out in his Gospel of Wealth, didn't hesitate to back his manager, Henry Clay Frick, in a plan that ended in violence. Yet the bond between Carnegie and Frick ran deeper than just a business partnership. At one point, they seemed to respect each other's cunning, ambition, and willingness to do whatever it took to make Carnegie Steel unstoppable. After Homestead's bloodshed, however, that partnership began to unravel. If you've heard about their falling out before, you might know only the basic outline. They had disagreements over strategy. They bickered about money, and eventually a wave of lawsuits in the 1890s brought all their resentments into the public eye. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Dig into archived New York Times articles from the late 19th century, and you'll find references to behind-the-scenes sabotage involving rumors supposedly spread by Carnegie against his old friend. The Times covered the lawsuits that erupted between the two men in language that hinted at revelations far uglier than standard business quarrels. According to those accounts, Andrew Carnegie was furious that Henry Clay Frick wouldn't simply walk away or quietly accept a lesser role after Homestead. Frick, for his part, believed he deserved full credit for having helped build the company, even if it meant using ruthless methods. Court documents from that era still stored in Pennsylvania, state archives and occasionally cited by historians, show that Frick claimed Carnegie actively tried to undermine his subsequent business ventures, using malicious rumors to steer investors away. The allegations included claims that Carnegie had quietly told potential partners Frick's finances were shaky, or that Frick's plans for new coke or steel operations were bound to fail because he wasn't as talented without Carnegie's oversight. Now, Carnegie never acknowledged this alleged rumor campaign in any direct statement. He was far too savvy for that before. Instead, he insisted that Frick simply misunderstood corporate restructurings, or that Frick was the one souring deals through his poor negotiating style. And yet, if you read the contemporary press, you'll find that the notion of active sabotage was repeated enough to gain traction. The Washington Post ran stories that portrayed Carnegie as an absentee manipulator who tried to orchestrate business outcomes from a comfortable distance, just as he'd done by being in Scotland during the Homestead crisis. Meanwhile, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and other local outlets took a more measured approach, saying that the sabotage rumors were credible but not fully proven, and that they might amount to nothing more than vicious gossip in a high-stakes feud. The feud itself is not in doubt. Scholars such as David Nasaw and Joseph Fraser Wall, both of whom wrote detailed biographies of Andrew Carnegie, confirmed that the relationship between these two once allied titans deteriorated rapidly after Homestead. The real question is whether Carnegie truly launched a campaign to discredit Frick's ventures, or whether this was largely a creation of newspaper speculation fueled by two big egos flinging accusations. We do know that lawsuits flew in both directions. Carnegie and Frick not only fought over the day-to-day corporate structures of Carnegie Steel, but also clashed over personal matters, including stock ownership, credit for the company's massive growth, and even the way in which the Homestead aftermath was handled. Frick, who had physically remained on site in Pennsylvania while the strike turned bloody, felt he was being hung out to dry by Carnegie's carefully worded public statements. Carnegie, by contrast, seemed to resent that Frick had grown so powerful and indispensable that he could challenge Carnegie's top dog status. In that sense, it's no surprise that some compare this rivalry to the Astor family feuds, which were driven by overlapping spheres of wealth, status, and personal grudges. If you've heard about the Astors, you'll know how their battles sometimes played out in the press, with one side hurling insinuations about moral failings, and the other side responding with carefully planted stories about extravagance or recklessness. The Carnegie-Frick battle had a similar flavor, except that, instead of primarily warring over social prestige, they waged war over who had the right to claim leadership of one of the era's most profitable industrial empires. If you dig into the memoirs of Henry Clay Frick, some of which are partially accessible through the Frick Collection in New York City and the University of Pittsburgh archives, you'll see references to how he felt betrayed by Carnegie's two-faced attitude. One letter, cited in passing by a blogger who consulted the archives, indicates that Frick believed Andrew Carnegie was funneling negative gossip to certain bankers in order to block loans for Frick's expansions. While these documents don't overtly prove sabotage, they bolster the sense that the tension went well beyond petty personal sniping. At least from Frick's viewpoint, it seemed that Carnegie wasn't content to let Frick flourish as a separate industrial power. He wanted to keep Frick's ambitions reined in. Interestingly, this dynamic parallels other dynastic rifts we've seen in American history. The Vanderbilt family, for instance, had infamous will disputes after Cornelius Vanderbilt's death, pitting siblings and cousins against one another in complicated lawsuits. In that environment, heirs would sometimes hurl accusations of mental incapacity, unfitness to manage money, or moral corruption, all of which made for sensational headlines. Though the Carnegie-Frick feud didn't revolve around inheritance in the same direct sense, the legal documents from their 1890s battles reveal an equally bitter tone, a sense that each man felt personally aggrieved and was willing to use the courts to prove it. When analyzing these public records, historians have pointed out how the language became less about constructive negotiation and more about personal attacks, with terms like duplicity and misrepresentation surfacing in the official complaints, while sensational rumors about violent plots might occasionally surface, especially given the Homestead precedent and the Pinkerton violence. Credible scholars caution that no solid evidence supports allegations that either man ever tried to physically harm the other. The two were savvy, but they also understood how catastrophically it could backfire if something like that were even attempted. By then, Andrew Carnegie had built his philanthropic persona, opening libraries and funding cultural institutions, and Henry Clay Frick was likewise establishing a reputation as an art collector and a force in Pittsburgh's development. A conspiratorial assassination or sabotage attempt would have outraged the public and forever stained whichever side undertook it. So while we can find references in sensational newspapers of the day speculating about all manner of accidents that might befall Frick or Carnegie, mainstream historians agree that these remain in the realm of rumor rather than fact. That said, sabotage doesn't have to mean bombs or physical threats. In a corporate sense, sabotage can refer to subtle maneuvers aimed at discrediting one's opponent among financiers, undermining contracts, or planting negative press items. The New York Times coverage from that period indeed hints that Carnegie's circle sowed seeds of doubt about Frick's reliability, though it never spelled out who specifically was doing the sowing. We do know that in the years after Homestead, Frick tried to diversify his holdings, investing in railroads, real estate, and other steel or coke ventures. It would have been quite easy for Carnegie, still boasting considerable clout, to place phone calls or write letters expressing polite concern about Frick's creditworthiness or the feasibility of his projects. For a Gilded Age industrialist, that sort of subtle rumor mill could be far more damaging than a punch in the face. In many ways, the feud symbolized a deeper fracture in how Gilded Age business partners dealt with each other once they grew too big for a single empire. Carnegie was the founder figure whose name branded the entire enterprise, but Frick had been essential to securing the raw materials, such as coke for fueling steel production, and to orchestrating expansions in ways that drastically cut costs, though often at the expense of labor conditions. That synergy had powered the rapid success of Carnegie Steel, but synergy turned into rivalry when each man believed the other had overstepped boundaries. Historians note that it's actually not uncommon for once allied titans to implode in exactly this manner. J.P. Morgan, for instance, had spats with other bankers over control of large trusts. The Guggenheims had internal rifts among siblings about business directions. The DuPont dynasty had some fractious moments regarding controlling shares in chemical ventures. However, the Carnegie-Frick conflict stands out for its level of acrimony and the swirl of sabotage stories that remain part of the historical gossip. Andrew Carnegie poured his fortune into libraries, education, and peace initiatives. History books generally focus on his personal convictions, his gospel of wealth, and the controversies swirling around his labor practices. But what if a crucial influence on Andrew Carnegie's decisions came from someone who chose to stay mostly in the background, someone whose name and face rarely starred in the headlines, but who left an unmistakable imprint on the philanthropic landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries? That someone, according to archival hints and a growing body of research, might have been his wife, Louise Whitfield Carnegie. She is often overshadowed by Andrew's towering reputation and overshadowed by more flamboyant female patrons like Peggy Guggenheim, who was anything but discreet about championing art and culture. And yet, if we look at the material from the Carnegie Corporation archives, old letters, personal diaries, and scattered references in newspaper reports of the time, it becomes clear that Louise had a significant hand in steering how Andrew deployed his vast wealth. The official narrative, with Andrew Carnegie front and center, never really shined a bright spotlight on her, but newly examined sources suggest her role may have been substantial. Even though Louise Carnegie maintained a softer public image, contemporary chatter, some of it gleaned from diaries, private letters, and even secondhand remarks in the New York Times Society columns, implies she was particularly intent on ensuring that money went to libraries, women's initiatives, and community projects. If you dig deep enough, you'll find subtle references that she also cared about deflecting or offsetting the unsavory after effects of Andrew's labor scandals, most notoriously the Homestead Strike of 1892. That was the strike that made him look in many eyes like a man who spoke about uplifting humanity, yet allowed armed Pinkerton agents to clash with striking steelworkers. According to materials archived by the Carnegie Corporation, Louise quietly believed the damage to Andrew's reputation could be softened through philanthropic gestures, specifically benefiting women, families, and local communities. Now, it's not like Louise stepped onto the public stage to say, "I'm taking charge of philanthropic strategy, folks." Compared to someone like Peggy Guggenheim, who was a flamboyant, absolutely unafraid to put her name front and center in the art world, Louise Carnegie was far more reserved. She seldom sought credit. In fact, the archives often portray her as deferring to Andrew in official documents, carefully letting him seem like the man in charge. This was partly a reflection of societal norms of the era. Women in elite circles were often expected to stay in the background, discreetly advising their husbands if they chose to do so at all. But it was also a personal choice. According to a small trove of letters housed in the Library of Congress, Louise's personality was gentle, quiet, and thoughtful, whereas Andrew's was direct, outspoken, and occasionally brash. Before we dive deeper into those letters, let's get a quick sense of Louise Whitfield herself. She was born in 1857 and married Andrew Carnegie in 1887, when he was already wealthy, but not yet at the peak of his philanthropic fame. If you check genealogical databases or old issues of the Pittsburgh Dispatch, you'll occasionally see mentions of her family's moderate social standing. She was not new money in the sense that Andrew was, but nor was she from the top-tier aristocracy. Her education was fairly thorough for a woman of her station, with some references suggesting she read widely and maintained a lively interest in the arts. Friends described her as politely assertive, meaning that while she knew how to hold her own in a conversation, she understood the social constraints of the time. In a letter discovered in the Carnegie Corporation archives, Louise wrote about her enjoyment in reading contemporary women writers and her admiration for some of the progressive ideas floating around in the late 1800s, particularly about women's roles in education and community leadership. When Andrew Carnegie launched his philanthropic spree, eventually becoming known for establishing over 2,500 libraries around the world among countless other projects, Louise was right there, quietly nurturing certain directions. This is not to say she told Andrew build exactly this many libraries, but it's plausible that she suggested how focusing on libraries would not only raise public literacy but also help with the family's tarnished image after the Homestead fiasco. If you skim the official records of the Carnegie Corporation, you'll find a few memos or notes referencing Mrs. Carnegie's interest in certain proposals. A blog post analyzing these archives pointed out that Louise sometimes corresponded with local women's groups, discussing what they needed to strengthen community outreach and educational programs. She didn't sign these letters Louise Carnegie in a flamboyant manner. Instead, they might have been signed L.C. or Mrs. Andrew Carnegie. That subtlety alone reveals a pattern. She was working behind the scenes, forging connections that might not have come about had her husband been the sole gatekeeper. By the time the 1900s rolled around, Andrew Carnegie's public image had started to shift away from controversial steel magnate toward benevolent benefactor of the people, especially through the lens of his gospel of wealth. But behind the scenes, if you read small clues from the Carnegie family's personal correspondences, you'll see that Louise apparently disliked how the labor scandals, particularly Homestead, continued to cloud her husband's name. A letter from 1902, stored in the Carnegie Museum of Natural History's special collections, includes a snippet where Louise confesses to a friend that the negativity still swirling from Homestead pained Andrew more than he let on. She wrote that continuing to enlarge philanthropic efforts was in the best interest of the family and the nation, implying that she saw big-scale giving as a moral and reputational necessity. The funny part is how rarely any official biography of Andrew Carnegie even hints that Louise might have shaped this philanthropic wave. Biographer Joseph Fraser Wall, in his extensive book Andrew Carnegie, devotes minimal space to her, though he occasionally references how she was supportive. However, if you cross-reference that biography with other sources, like the diaries of certain Carnegie household staff or the scribbles of secretaries who assisted the family, you'll find fleeting remarks about her opinions carrying weight behind closed doors. One domestic servant wrote in a personal memoir that Mrs. Carnegie would sometimes take Mr. Carnegie aside after dinner to discuss philanthropic matters. She had some strong feelings about the needs of women's colleges. This might not sound like a bombshell, but it's exactly the sort of daily life detail that reveals a person's hidden hand in shaping big decisions. The archives at the Carnegie Corporation caution that there is no definitive proof of her pulling the strings, while Andrew simply nodded. But those same archives strongly suggest that Louise had a lot more input than the official public statements acknowledged. One reason we suspect she was pivotal: after Andrew's death in 1919, Louise continued to make philanthropic decisions consistent with his general goals, but also aligned with projects that specifically aided women and children. She contributed to organizations focusing on maternal health and vocational training for women, sometimes in partnership with the YWCA or local Pittsburgh philanthropic societies. Yet she avoided the limelight, signing checks under formal trust arrangements or redirecting them through Carnegie foundations, so that her name barely surfaced in the press. All the while, the mainstream story stayed locked on Andrew, the man of steel turned philanthropic hero. Of course, it's not just a matter of picking a favorite philanthropic cause. Louise's quiet influence might have served as damage control for Andrew's image after the Homestead strike. According to historians who studied the strike's long aftermath, the public backlash against Andrew was strong in labor circles. The Pinkerton agent's violent confrontation with steelworkers in 1892 left a scar on his record that no amount of well-crafted essays, even if some were potentially ghost-written, could fully erase. On top of that, the feud between Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick was another gaping wound. Louise might have recognized that to truly pivot Andrew's reputation from brutal industrialist to benevolent philanthropist, the family's giving needed to include a softer, human-centric edge. Funding libraries was one route, but supporting women's causes, still underrepresented in that era, added an extra dimension that hinted at moral responsibility and compassion. Women's issues at the turn of the century ranged from basic education to suffrage movements to social welfare programs. While we don't see Louise championing suffrage in the same overt way that, say, Alva Belmont or Carrie Chapman Catt did, there's enough anecdotal evidence to indicate that she believed in broadening opportunities for women. The Carnegie Corporation eventually backed certain educational initiatives that benefited women specifically, though official records rarely label these as women's causes. They're often described in general terms like community improvement, teacher education, or youth programs. Yet in some of Louise's personal correspondences, quoted in blog posts by independent historians who access portions of the archives, she mentioned wanting to see young ladies given a path to instruct others, to lead the mind and heart. According to articles in American Heritage and certain nativist organization records from the 1890s, Carnegie simultaneously backed groups that opposed further immigration, especially from regions he feared might stir labor unrest. It's a startling contradiction. The same man who publicly declared that America was a land of opportunity was privately funneling money to nativist causes, anxious about the wrong sort of immigrants flooding in. He wasn't the only figure of his era plagued by moral and ethical contradictions. The DuPont family, for instance, faced its own controversies, such as supplying gunpowder to the Confederacy during the Civil War. But Carnegie's hypocrisy here, given his own immigrant roots, stands out as especially jarring. To unravel this paradox, we need to step back to the 1890s, an era of rapid industrialization, major labor conflicts, and intense debates around immigration. At this point, Andrew Carnegie had long since moved beyond his early telegraph clerk days in Pittsburgh. He was firmly established as a steel titan, controlling a vast empire that included the Homestead Works and other major mills. In public speeches, he loved to reference his journey from an impoverished Scottish boy to a triumphant American capitalist. Newspapers such as the New York Times, the Pittsburgh Press, and the Chicago Tribune often featured him extolling the virtues of self-reliance and praising the United States as a melting pot. He famously wrote essays like The Gospel of Wealth, insisting that the wealthy should use their fortunes for the good of society. Immigrants, in Carnegie's telling, merely needed to adopt good work habits and a frugal mindset. Then they too could ascend the social ladder just as he had. But behind the scenes, says an article from American Heritage, Carnegie appears to have grown increasingly anxious about waves of new immigrants entering America, particularly those he saw as radical or prone to socialist or anarchist ideas. Some historians point out that this anxiety likely spiked after the 1892 Homestead Strike, one of the most violent labor disputes in American history, in which Pinkerton agents clashed with striking workers. Many of those workers were either first or second generation immigrants from Eastern Europe and other regions Carnegie might have deemed politically volatile. The fear was that foreign-born laborers brought with them more aggressive stances on unionization. Perhaps they were more willing to unionize or more likely to accept radical ideologies championing workers' rights. Although some might argue that Carnegie had always been open to new immigration, the 1890s introduced a shift. Certain private letters uncovered in specialized archives, referenced by a couple of blogs analyzing the Gilded Age, hint that he quietly donated funds to a handful of nativist groups. These organizations, while not necessarily mainstream, were pushing for stricter controls on who could enter the country. They feared that large numbers of immigrants with different languages, customs, and potential political radicalism could destabilize the labor market. Carnegie, according to these partial records, wasn't about to become their poster boy. In fact, the same sources indicate he insisted on anonymity, not wanting to tarnish his public image as a self-made man who had made it in America, precisely because the borders were open when he arrived as a boy. To this day, the extent of his involvement remains murky. No single smoking gun letter has surfaced in which Carnegie openly states, "I oppose these immigrants and wish to keep them out." Instead, we have small glimpses in nativist group ledgers or meeting minutes that mention receiving private support from wealthy individuals, cross-referenced with notes from the philanthropic offices that manage Carnegie's lesser-known donations. The amounts aren't huge when compared to the millions he poured into building libraries or endowing institutions, but the significance is more moral than monetary. How could a man who forever touted the American dream fear and even helped to undermine the very phenomenon that made him successful? Some historians suspect the contradiction might be rooted in a deep-seated desire to protect his empire from further upheavals like Homestead. Looking at Carnegie's own statements from the 1890s yields contradictions. In a public speech reported by the New York World, he declared, "This nation is a grand workshop in which all the nations of the world may unite to produce a better future for humanity." Yet at the same time, he wrote private correspondence, some of which ended up in the Carnegie family archives, expressing concern about unassimilated foreigners. While he never named specific groups in those short notes, secondary commentary from researchers suggests he was concerned about Southeastern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and other laborers who might import socialist or anarchist sentiments. Considering the era's overall climate, it wouldn't be surprising if Carnegie shared the prejudice of many Gilded Age industrialists who believed these newly arrived immigrants were fueling Union radicalism. What did these nativist groups actually stand for, and which ones might have enjoyed Carnegie's hush-hush support? Some historians point to fragments of records from organizations that took root in the Northeast and industrial Midwest, places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York. A few went under names such as the Immigration Restriction League, founded in 1894, or local nativist clubs that advocated literacy tests for newcomers. The Immigration Restriction League, in particular, is known to have received donations from various wealthy figures who were uneasy about the influx of undesirable immigrants. Newspaper investigations from the time occasionally identified donors, but often the lists were incomplete. If Carnegie's name wasn't openly listed, that might only indicate he gave money through intermediaries. The rumor mill, as documented in smaller local publications like the Pittsburgh Dispatch, suggested that some leading industrial voices were contributing to these leagues in an effort to keep labor costs stable and avoid further episodes of worker solidarity. Because once immigrants achieved legal status and overcame language barriers, they might unionize or strike, costing employers higher wages or leading to conflicts. One can't help but wonder if the workers in Carnegie's mills, especially those who were themselves recent arrivals, had any inkling that their boss might be funding the very groups that wanted to curb immigration. The most likely answer is no. At that time, many steelworkers were from regions like Bohemia, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Italy or Poland, trying to eke out a living in the rough conditions of industrial Pennsylvania. They probably heard Andrew Carnegie's statements about how he, too, was once a struggling newcomer. They might have believed him sincere when he spoke of wanting a bright future for men of enterprise, no matter their origins. The documents that reference Carnegie's behind-the-scenes support for nativist causes rarely made it into mainstream newspapers, and they certainly didn't become common knowledge in the mills. Of course, it's worth noting that Carnegie wasn't alone in harboring these contradictory views. The Gilded Age was rife with xenophobia. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had already set a precedent, showing that the federal government was willing to ban a specific ethnic group from entering the country. Many business owners, especially in manufacturing and railroads, quietly supported such measures if they thought it would limit troublesome labor segments or prevent new groups from banding together in strikes. The fear of anarchists after high-profile incidents like the 1886 Haymarket affair in Chicago, fed into a broader narrative that too many immigrants might threaten American stability. So, while Carnegie may have personally exemplified the rags to riches story, he also lived in an era when powerful men saw no problem championing immigration in principle, but discouraging it in reality, especially if it might chip away at corporate control. The Carnegie family has long been dogged by rumors of an eerie curse that supposedly claimed the lives of multiple family members. It's reminiscent of the kind of myth people circulate about the Onassis or Astor families, tales of tragedy that pile up over the decades until the public starts whispering about supernatural forces. Even the New York Times has alluded to these tragic losses, referencing the early death of Thomas Carnegie, the shocking childbirth-related passing of Louise Carnegie Miller, and a string of grandchildren's fatal accidents that left a mark on the family's collective memory. Then there's Margaret Carnegie's rumored mental health struggles, said to have been carefully brushed under the rug, much like hush-hush family secrets in other great dynasties. But does any real curse exist, or are we just looking at heartbreak magnified by wealth and fame? And to what extent did the Carnegies try to hide details of these tragedies, perhaps fearing the damage to their philanthropic, carefully curated image? First, we have to establish some factual anchors. Thomas Carnegie, brother to Andrew, died in 1886 from pneumonia, a disease that was often fatal in that period, especially if complications set in. The Carnegie family had already begun accumulating substantial wealth by that time. Andrew's steel enterprises were well on their way to dominance, even if the pinnacle of the empire had not yet been reached. Historical references in diaries, newspapers, and genealogical sources confirm that Thomas was a pivotal figure in some of the family's investments, especially in the early days of their expansions. According to public obituaries from local Pittsburgh papers, his death was considered a blow to the family, not just personally, but operationally, because his steady involvement had kept certain business matters running smoothly. Yet little is spoken of him these days, overshadowed by Andrew's towering legacy. Over time, as subsequent misfortunes befell the Carnegies, people started retroactively pointing to Thomas's passing as one link in a chain of family tragedies. Fast forward to 1947, and another devastating event, the death of Louise Carnegie Miller during childbirth. Louise was Andrew Carnegie's granddaughter, not to be confused with Louise Whitfield Carnegie, Andrew's wife. Though genealogical charts can be tricky, the key is that this younger Louise's untimely passing hammered home the notion that the Carnegies were no strangers to heartbreak. The New York Times, in an article exploring the lineage of multiple Gilded Age families, briefly mentioned her death, highlighting the irony that a clan so wealthy and philanthropic could not stave off life's harshest realities. Childbirth complications in the mid-20th century were far less frequent than in earlier eras thanks to improved medical care, but they weren't unheard of. Still, her passing was a jolt, prompting hushed discussions about a curse that seemed determined to strike Carnegies down before their time. Though official statements about Louise Miller's death were circumspect, a few blog posts and local news columns from that year reveal that the tragedy rattled the extended family, with many refusing to speak publicly about it. Rumor had it that certain relatives felt the press coverage might tarnish the philanthropic narrative Andrew Carnegie had cultivated. If the family was truly cursed, how would it look for a dynasty that prided itself on championing the promise of modern progress and social betterment? But it doesn't stop there. Multiple Carnegie grandchildren, across various branches of the family tree, died in accidents, some in car crashes, some in less publicized mishaps that ended up mentioned only in local police reports or smaller newspaper obituaries. Digging into genealogical forums, you'll sometimes see scattered references to these tragedies, each footnoted with half-baked theories, linking them into a grand pattern. Rarely do the mainstream accounts dwell on these accidents in detail, which only fuels speculation that the Carnegies tried to keep the stories quiet, especially in the face of sensational curse rumors. Historians who've studied the family say it's not necessarily that the Carnegies had anything to hide, but more that they were private. They tended not to share the raw details of personal grief, especially in eras when mental health or personal vulnerabilities were taboo topics. And so these deaths accumulated in the public imagination, each new story layered onto the old, creating the mystique of a lurking doom overshadowing the clan. Every so often, you'll see parallels drawn to other families rumored to be under some dark shadow. The Astors, for example, had John Jacob Astor, the fourth, famously perish on the Titanic, leading some to label the Astors as cursed. The Guggenheims, as well, lost children under tragic circumstances. Indeed, Peggy Guggenheim endured heartbreak with the early deaths of some of her relatives, and Benjamin Guggenheim perished on the Titanic, fueling a wave of speculation about a Guggenheim curse. Then there's the Onassis saga, with the sudden deaths of heirs and high-profile tragedies that tabloids love to label as evidence of a jinx. People have a habit of seeing patterns where random misfortunes overlap, especially among wealthy families in the public eye. The Carnegies are no exception. One detail that looms large in these discussions is the alleged cover-up, or at least the suppression of information regarding Margaret Carnegie's mental health struggles after some of these tragedies. Andrew Carnegie's daughter, Margaret, is said to have experienced profound emotional distress, culminating in what a few accounts describe as a nervous breakdown or an ongoing battle with depression. The New York Times apparently alluded to it obliquely, though never delving into specifics. If you scour old interviews with extended family members or rummage through local Pittsburgh archives, you'll find hints that Margaret was hospitalized at times or retreated from public life after certain catastrophic losses. Some of these references parallel the Onassis family's attempts to hide heartbreak, preserving a polished facade while behind closed doors they dealt with intense sorrow and turmoil. The question arises, how much of this mental health cover-up was real, and how much was just rumor inflated by retellings over decades? Sources differ. Some genealogical research blogs claim to have uncovered diaries or letters that prove Margaret's struggles were systematically buried by the family's PR apparatus. Others point out that mental health issues were heavily stigmatized back then. It wouldn't necessarily require a sinister cover-up so much as a reflection of societal norms. Families of that stature, especially those with philanthropic reputations to guard, had powerful motives to avoid front-page drama about mental institutions or psychological breakdowns. So it's plausible that relatives told polite half-truths or minimized the severity of Margaret's condition, allowing official statements to revolve around her delicate constitution or her desire for private rest. We see echoes of that approach in other dynasties too, like certain Vanderbilt family members who were quietly placed in sanitariums while the official story claimed they were on extended vacations. Of course, none of these tragedies or mental health battles necessarily prove there's a genuine curse. Historians, psychiatrists, and genealogical enthusiasts who've dissected these events generally dismiss any supernatural explanation. Accidents, pneumonia, especially in the 19th century, and childbirth complications are tragically common across the board. Meanwhile, Mental health struggles can be triggered by repeated losses and the suffocating pressure of living in a family known worldwide for its wealth and philanthropic empire. The Carnegies, after all, weren't the only wealthy clan to experience multiple heartbreaks. Yet the curse rumor persists, partly because newspapers and tabloids have latched onto it over time, and partly because the family's reticence fosters further speculation. When important details remain private, it's easy for onlookers to fill in the gaps with ghost stories or twisted fate narratives.